All right, I'm Mary Whitton. I'm moderating this one. We've nominally called it early graphics, and that kind of covers a lot of things. We have 5 panelists, notable people who were here sort of in the, think of it as sort of before the VRs got really going in the department. And because I forgot already, the Brooks family has asked, there is a guest book outside in the lobby, and please sign it. There are green pens and only green pens, no red to offend anybody. And there was actually a Pentel out there for a while, and I bet Ben Locke stole it. Okay, let me introduce my panel. In the 3 remote, 2 local. The reason we're get an hour and everybody else got 45 minutes because we got an extra. First into the working with the department is Jane Richardson. And you always hear Jane and Dave or Dave and Jane.
Yeah,
and it's part of a Nick and Mary thing. I understand about that. They came to the Triangle in 71, I think at Duke. My undergrad's from Duke. Fred's undergrad was from Duke. Turner Whitten's undergrad is from Duke. For a while, we were the only 3 graphics people who went to Duke. Then Mike Pique came in 1973. Henry came in 78. Andrew Glassner, lower left. Yeah, in 74. And Russ, 84 and 89. So Jane describes her relationship with Fred, years of intensely interacting in the graphics lab. They were from approximately 71 to 96. That's a long run, 25 years.
Actually, Jim Lipscomb corrected me. It was later than 71. It was probably 73 when we moved over. We came to Duke in 70, but
well, I will correct that.
Remember it as being forever.
I will correct that in green pen. Their roles were, I love this, chemist, guinea pig, pre-alpha tester, and active user of the resources being developed, and doing lots of projects jointly with students. And they are now still active professors in the Duke Department of Biochemistry. Michael Pique came late in August 73 as a graduate student. After a brief chat, he said, brief, I suspect it was very brief. With Fred, he got put on the molecular graphics project, joining 2nd-year student Jim Lipscomb. That doubled the manpower on that thing, that project. They worked with Bill Wright, who was working at Carolina, but still working for IBM. So he was a grad student until the summer of 80, and then on staff working very closely with the molecular modeling people and with the collaborative users who came. And he says about his current position, Scripps had to call me something, and he wasn't a faculty and he wanted a postdoc. So he was director of computer graphics development at the Scripps Institute. Now, Henry was not so effusive. He says, I came in 78 and I was a colleague until Fred died. And I am now Frederico Gill, Distinguished Professor of Computer Science and Adjunct Professor of Biomedical Engineering. But surely you have something outrageous about yourself to say.
Outrageous?
Yes.
Me? Moi? I've been interested in show tunes
Just
recently.
one sentence.
One sentence.
Yeah. That's more than one
I'd rather
word.
be playing violin maybe now.
Okay, he plays violin, him and Sherlock Holmes. Glassner came in 84 as a grad student, was here only until 88, 4 years, very quick. He says he originally worked for Turner, he worked on grip for a semester, then he went to Holland and did some teaching, and he came back and he soon graduated. We will hear stories about his graduation. He said he thought he was a principal research scientist, but then when the credits for Avatar 2 came out, he was called a distinguished researcher, so he guesses that's what he is now. Russ came in 89, was a student, and worked in the department until 2015. PhD advisee under Fred, 91 to 94, and colleague after that, and he's currently self-employed doing consulting and an adjunct. Now he's still working with the Richardsons. So these relationships go back a long time. Okay, now I gotta get them. So I was asked to start off with telling you how Fred got involved in graphics. And there's a lovely clip in the interview from which you saw the other clip this morning in Gary's interview with Fred, where he asked him, how did you get involved in graphics? And he says, well, I was doing computer architecture and computer software. And with computer architecture, you need a factory keeping price performance and customers in mind to keep you honest about not doing something unreasonable. Software engineering, you need a big community of of software developers, and the triangle had not developed this at that time. So I said, well, neither of those was a good area. And he'd been interested in graphics for a while. He had programmed the graphics head on the IBM 704. And as he phrased it, I had seen to it that when we announced the 360, the 2250 graphics engine was announced at the same time. Now, if you're old enough, 2250, 3250 means something to you, but it was the terminal for early CAD packages. So he said, I saw to it that it was announced. And so that's, to me, says a commitment to graphics early. So he said, I think graphics had two advantages. It was not respectable by either engineering or mathematics. And so there was very little competition. And it was fascinating. So he picked that and said, this is what I want to do. That is how Fred came to do graphics. And I learned things from that I had never known before. All right, so there's this thing about Dr. Brooks, Dr. Frederick Phillips Brooks, Jr. What the heck do you call him? And Andrew has a story about what you call Dr. Brooks.
Well, here's what I called him. When I showed up to UNC for the first time, I made it a point to talk to the faculty, all of whom I was in awe of, and hardly could believe I was sitting in the same room with them. Nevertheless, there I was in the same room with Dr. Professor Turner Whitted, and we were having a conversation. And at some point, he said, "Oh, just call me Turner. You know, none of this Dr. Whitted stuff." Okay, Professor Whitted. No, just Turner. Okay. So the day went on, and I think later that day I was talking to Professor Dr. Henry Fuchs. And we're talking, and at one point I said, "Well, Dr. Fuchs," and he said, No, call me Henry." "Oh, okay, Henry." And the conversation went on. So I thought, okay. Later the day, at the end of the day, I was speaking with Dr. Brooks. So, after the pleasantries were over, I said, "So I've been speaking with some of the other professors, and I'd like to get off on a good start. What would you like me to call you?" And he just sat there for a moment and looked at me and said, "What do you suggest?" And I said, "Dr. Brooks." And he said, "That will do fine." And for the rest of my life, he has been Dr. Brooks to me. And one time speaking with Mike Pique, I dared myself to refer to him as Fred. And I wasn't struck by lightning, but I've never done it again. And so to me, he is always and will always be Dr. Brooks.
Thank you, Andrew. So for those of you who know, we have got a laptop here so we can, without doing this, can see the other speakers if we're focusing on that. Yes, thanks to Mike Pique, who said, "Let me just put my laptop down there." We've got a lot of people who are involved in molecular modeling here. Russ, do you want to tell us about how Fred got involved in molecular modeling? See, I am looking over my shoulder.
Yeah, this is the story that he tells in the interview with Gary Bishop about his Turing Award. And he says he basically went to the provost, who was Charlie Morrow, and said, I now have a really bright graduate student and a hardware graphics display engine, and I want to build an intelligence amplification system for somebody. Who on this campus most deserves to have his intelligence amplified? And Charlie said, deserves or needs. And then he said, I have to think about this. And he came back a few days later with a list of 12 campus entities that made a lot of sense. And one was a young chemist who was working on proteins. And so Fred started working with them. And then later he had a contact from Duke who was interested in working on a system. And he introduced him to David J. and Richardson, who were protein crystallographers. And they started a collaboration that lasted 30 years and was very effective for the whole team. In fact, the first protein that was ever solved without building a brass model was solved on the GRIP 75 system in the Brooks lab by David Jane Richardson. And as Mary mentioned, for the last few years, I've actually been once again working with the Richardsons, and his son Ken has been working with us to kind of get their mold probity system into the next tool. So it's indeed been a fantastic tool building exercise. And I understand from Jane that it also was kind of a recursive tool building exercise.
So Jane, do you want to follow up on that?
Well, it was just a great thing in our lives all that time. And I guess Dave always says one of his favorite memories was when one of the times that we were working in one iteration of the graphics lab, which was a great place because it was so open. You could do your own stuff, but you also talked to other people. And Russ was the one that we would go sit next to when he was around. He was always doing interesting things, and he was good at helping us with things, and just good to be around. And of course, Fred's been an enormous influence on our lives. On Wikipedia, we listed 3 different people who we think of as mentors: Chris Anfinson and Fred Richards and Fred Brooks. And one of the things, of course, that he did for us was make us into toolsmiths. We still love, doing the research and looking at the proteins, but we also really get a lot of satisfaction out of building tools that other people can use. And so I guess actually the ribbons are one of those. I hadn't thought of it that way before, but certainly Malprobity is. It's a pretty weird thing to be in validation and telling people what's wrong with their structures. It's not a good way to make friends or get funded, actually. But the only reason it works is that we make tools that help other people correct the problems. And so that works to be satisfied. But those early days were fantastic. It was like being in a science fiction movie, and all these neat new things happening, and some of them just became absolute norm for the field, and some of them would beat you in the chest or drip oil on you or something. I don't remember that any of them didn't work. There must have been a few, but working a little bit on preparing with Mike and Jim and the whole team, getting these things together, and then having the data to do our high resolution, complete model building, all on the computer. And it had a wonderful, very concise way of using lines to show what you were looking at. It was actually the midlines of the density, and then for rings, it usually ended up making a sort of cross pattern that filled in the flat round density on a ring. And it was just a lot of fun to use, and really worked marvelously. And it took quite a long time. It's a small protein, but still doing it on this system was not fast, but it was super new and wonderful for its time. Absolutely. It was a real watershed. And then right after us, Cernigo and Petsko came and did a tracing of their, theirs, I guess, was actually a, well, it was one of the toxins. It was actually very closely related to a structure I'd gotten to do some on with Barbara Lowe, rabutoxin. Anyway, that was fit on the same system only a month or 2 later, I think. But they managed to publish first. So mostly when people say what was the first thing done on here, they get it wrong. And then after that, there was this huge parade of users. This was the thing for a few years. I don't remember how long exactly, until Frodo came out. And that actually could be done on more normal hardware. I mean, at that point, it took up 2 rooms worth of computers. There was the setup with the control panel and the most wonderful manipulation tools. I guess my favorite was the toothpick, but you know, there were about a dozen different things that you could use, all of them better than a mouse.
Mhm.
I think that-
We've missed those things a lot.
Mm.
Oh,
You can get things close to it these days that are even better, but it was quite a setup. And then the back room with the big computer that was doing the calculations to support all of this. And we spent a lot of nights there. I remember one time we went home and discovered the next day that if we'd been half an hour later, we might not have gotten out of town because it was one of UNC's big wins in football. So the next day, all the trees were full of toilet paper and there, you know, but we managed to get out early enough and we got home.
Thank you for those memories, Jane. I think she mentioned the toothpick, and I looked for one yesterday and couldn't find it. I know where it used to be. So, but it was a device that you could do 3 degrees of freedom in rotations, all with one device in one hand. When we have a photograph on the one of the hall walls, that the story goes that there were 19 different controls in the grip system, and that there was a tangible interface for each one of the 19 things. And we've lost that with the mouse. And I think it's interesting. And it's also interesting to think about how concerned we were with user interface as a group back, even that far back. Mike, you came not too long after that. Can you kind of give us a sense of how the lab worked with the collaborators coming in? Is that something you can speak to?
It was important. It was a busy time when we were doing this, that we moved within a space of 18 months from people like Dave and Jane and their graduate students, John Taylor and Libby Getzoff. I won't say grudgingly coming over, but they would come over and we'd find serious problems. And if you tried to contour an electron density map that had certain singularities and things that scalar fields can do, it'd crash. And so they would have to have patience. But then in the space of about 18 months, things firmed up enough that the word started spreading at the biochemistry, the crystallography conferences, that if you had a problem that would fit, it was great, because otherwise you not only had to make a big physical model, I mean, 4 or 5 feet tall, but then you had to drop a plumb bob from each point on it to a piece of graph paper for the position of that atom, punch it up on cards, and refine your structure, which means taking those approximate atom positions and using gradient methods, move them more towards where they were. But yeah, we moved from just a few users to people having to schedule a visit, typically 2 weeks, months in advance. And it paid off though. The computer science department had sent an application into the National Institutes of Health to continue this kind of work. And in due course, the NIH scheduled what they call a site visit. They would send 8 or 10 experts in the field, people who knew Dave and Jane, but were not directly on the grant proposals, to come evaluate our plans and see our place. So the pattern for a site visit was pretty well established. There'd be an introduction. We were computer people, so computer people would talk about the algorithms, computer people would talk about the constraints, computer people would talk about why we needed new hardware, maybe a color display instead of black and white. And we hadn't done especially well with those site visits, but Dr. Brooks turned this one on its head. He gave a brief introduction, then representatives of that parade of users we just heard about came and talked tangentially about our graphic system, and maybe because you could compare 2 structures just flicking back and forth and see the differences between, you know, oxidized and reduced. But they talked pure science. what they had done, what papers had come out of it, and where they were going to go next. And as the last one of that parade of users, talking to our visiting scientist, Dr. Judy Kelly from University of Connecticut, could not be there in person, but we made a video recording of her explaining what she had done. And then in this stroke of genius, there was this darkened room, a speakerphone, and a spotlight. And she was there talking to the site visitors. And that just clicked. And then to follow up on that, the site visit committee would adjourn and have a snack, and then they'd be reconvening to write their report. And I'll never forget, Dr. Brooks was there, and he put up this overhead projector foil, and it says, "Here's what we think your report should say." And I paraphrase, but he just said let's see, where did basically this team had demonstrated their ability to connect the community, to get real science done, and the goals were ambitious, but we think this team can pull them off, and we strongly endorse their proposal.
And as I recall, that particular NIH grant went on for,
That was a 5-year renewal, which is really helpful in this kind of work.
and then
But it went
again-
on for until like I took over, and then Rich Superfine took over, and then they shut down the entire NCRR program before it got shut down.
Hey, you get rid of Carolina and it's just not worth keeping on.
But really, by his focus on our users, it paid off, and as Jane Richardson has said, that reinforced this idea that tool builders have a place.
And my favorite quote from the time was one of the collaborators that said, "I can do in a week what used to take me a calendar quarter."
Yeah. So Henry, you came along next. Is there a story about your coming to Carolina?
Sure. So I remember distinctly coming to Carolina to interview only because one of my friends and colleagues suggested that this would be a good place. And the strong things that I remember is I remember a demo of the system by Mike Pique and Jim Lipscomb, that this was a really mature working graphic system. You know, this was not one of the standard kind of lab demos. This was a mature system that was really running and doing something useful.
1,000 hours of outside users logged in 1 year.
Yeah, it was just amazing. But then what I remember is first time I actually met Fred. So I had, of course, heard about him by reputation because I had studied computer architecture and I had heard about the IBM 360. But I remember I gave a talk and I didn't have a meeting with him until afterwards. And after the talk, there was a crowd of a half a dozen or 8 people standing around talking to me and asking questions. And then I think occurred that had never occurred to me before or since. In the middle of this conversation, the seas parted. It's like they all knew something was happening. The people on the left turned to the left, people on the right turned to the right. And this middle-aged man came up the middle, his hand extended, says, "Hi, I'm Fred Brooks." Whoa, I thought. How did they know he was coming up? But I got over this quickly because I remember having a very pleasant long dinner with him that evening, and then had a very pleasant set of meetings with various faculty and staff and students the next day. And the last appointment on my calendar before, I think Peter Callengart took me to the airport, the last appointment was to see Fred. And as I walk into his office, this is in New West Hall, he is signing what appears to be a 3-page memo. I didn't think anything of it, except as I approach him, he hands it to me and he says, "I think you need to sign this too." I flip to the first page and it says, invention disclosure, a new 3D display, Henry Fuchs, Fred Brooks, co-inventors. What? He said, you know, the stuff we talked about last night at dinner, I think we could build that. And I think it's worth disclosing. What do you think? And he hands me the pen. That was very impressive to me because here's this guy I just met less than 24 hours ago. And he was the department chair. And he, from the time of whatever it was, 9 o'clock at night to, you know, this was 3 in the afternoon the next day, writes up this intelligent memo that's 3 pages. So I was really impressed. So could I say one more
You
story?
can tell the rest of
Okay.
it.
Then I get this letter offer. And in it are the various details. You know, I don't know, usual thing, you know, I don't get many of these. But what I remember is he said in one of the closing paragraphs, I cannot guarantee you summer salary, but I will try to get it for you. And if necessary, I will forgo summer salary so you could be paid. Wow.
Wow.
This is a person worth being with. I called up the other place that had been wooing me, much more famous. And I said, I'm going to Carolina. That's how I came here.
All right. And that, I think, shows something about Fred's ability to judge things and make decisions. And I think there are other people who have stories about his decisiveness. Andrew? Russ?
Yes.
Yes, go.
Did you have something in mind?
Effectiveness.
Probably your graduation and your career
Oh.
choice.
Your dissertation.
So I was, I got my master's degree, and at the time, one of the, and probably still is, there was a rule that you had to have primary teaching responsibility for a class because teaching was important. One of the many things that I love about the department. So I went to Holland for a summer job, and I went to the Technical University of Delft. And then they said, why don't you stay and teach a course? And at the time, I think we had the Usenet, but it wasn't really how you corresponded with people. So Dr. Brooks and I would be on the phone. He was my thesis advisor, and we would be on the phone once a week. And we would have usually a fairly brief chat because these phone calls were very expensive. So at one point I called him up and said, I'd like to stay and do this class here as my primary teaching responsibility. Would that be okay? And he said, sure. So the semester goes on. And at one point, my office mate, one of the professors at the department, said, are you going to finish your PhD very soon? And I said, no, I haven't even started my dissertation. I'm going to spend a few years with my head down, solving a problem of importance and contribute to the field. And he said, well, that seems strange because here in Europe, if someone has a number of published papers, and I had at the time, he said, we just bundle them together and we call it your dissertation and you graduate and move on. And I said, yeah, but that's not how we do it in the United States. And he said, all right. And that was the end of it. So that week or the next week, I'm on the phone with Dr. Brooks. And I just casually, out of curiosity, I told him the story. And I said, so I told him that's not what we do in the United States. And Dr. Brooks said, that's right. We don't do that. I said, so I was just wondering why not? And he said, I can't think of any reason we shouldn't. And I said, then I could. And he said, and you will. And I came back to Chapel Hill in January, and I was graduated in what, May? Basically, I wrote an opening and a closing chapter, ran everything past the committee a couple of times, and that was my dissertation.
The man could make a decision. Mike, you want to tell the other dissertation story that we?
Oh. Yeah, this actually is Jim Lipscomb's story, which you'll find on his website if you Google for the how to think like Fred Brooks. It'll pop right up. Jim had done an elaborate thesis project, master's thesis thing involving the user experience recording and such. Again, Jim could tell this far better, but the technical limitations don't let us do that. So I'll fill in. So that basically he had a very, very long master's thesis and decided one night that he would print it out with a different cover page, the one that says in partial fulfillment of the dissertation doctorate thing, but otherwise unchanged. And people's recollections of this differ, but I remember him printing that out, cackling about that. And then depending on which version, either Dr. Brooks read the whole thing through and then saw the title page, or saw the title page and took it to other faculty members who agreed with that it was more a dissertation, but that in order not to play any favorites, that Jim would still have to go through the written exam, the oral exam, the PhD proposal and all of that. And so Jim, and that according to Jim, that Dr. Brooks said, and if you don't succeed in all those things, we won't ever bring this up again. And Jim did succeed and rightfully graduated with his PhD. And again, I refer you to his delightful little essay for his rendition of that.
But that kind of deep insight cut both ways. I remember one time when we'd worked with the School of Education and we put together a nanomanipulator taken to middle school so kids could move around molecules in the classroom to see if they learned better. And then we worked on a virtual haptic cell, and then we're like, what could we do next? I know, we'll make a terrarium where they can watch plants grow in the virtual environment. We talked about how we might do this and how we might do this. And so we were excited. And so we took it to Fred, and he basically thought for a minute, and he said, how is this in any way better than actual plants growing in the classroom? Does it take so long for them to grow? Teach them the real thing, not the model. It will be better, right? And this was one of his, one of the quotes I remember from him is, "There's no right way to do a wrong thing."
Yeah, he was incredible with these aphorisms that stick with you. There are two, at least, that I use frequently. One, and I've used this more times than I can count. The first one is, make one to throw away and then throw it away. And that second part is really hard, but it's really important. And I just finished a book recently, and I wrote to my editor and I said, I'm done, I've written it. And she said, that's great, when can we see it? And I said, oh, when I'm done writing it again. Because I'm throwing away the first one. The other was his frequent, and this is just sort of a worldview of breaking problems into architecture, implementation, and realization. That is such a powerful concept for understanding structure of complicated systems that I rely on it still.
That kind of tells us some of the characteristics. Actually, Russ, you've collected sayings and aphorisms. You want to give us a couple more of them?
I did. I have a dozen or so, but I'll stick with my top 5, right? So one was, speak to inform, not to impress. If you inform, you will also impress. Another was, be careful not to provide more verisimilitude than veracity, right? So ChatGPT could learn something from that. Right?
Oh, boy.
Sometimes it's better to be specific and wrong than to be vague. And I've used that one so many times in design reviews because people don't understand what I'm talking about, and they think they do otherwise. You can't get something for nothing unless you've previously gotten nothing for something. Right. So the example of sending the $30,000 and the $40,000 to Duke and to NC State is an example of that one bearing later fruit. And then a scientist may spend all of his time building an apparatus, and an engineer may spend all of his time studying nature, but the scientist builds in order to learn, and the engineer learns in order to build.
And as an engineer, that one is near and dear to my heart. Who's got something else to say?
Oh,
Go for it,
Can I
Henry.
jump in? Oh,
You
there's
may.
so many things to say. I mean, just looking out of this audience. Joe Kapowski's story about the arm from the Atomic Energy Commission. Now, Joe, you could see if I've got this wrong. Okay, this was before my time. And my recollection, you could correct me if I'm wrong, was that at a certain time in the grip system, you know, with interaction with, maybe it was later.
The force feedback.
Yeah, the force feedback one, GROPE, thank you. Fred acquired the rights to get a couple of the control arms from Argonne National Lab. Did I have this right? Okay, and that was for use for being able to manipulate things that were radioactive, right? Through, you know, very thick leaded walls. But after a while, the slave arm gets radioactive and has to be buried. But the master arm might still be good. Do I have this right? And so the only problem was that the arm, in fact, I think there were two of them. Were there two? Two were at Argonne outside of Chicago. Where is it? Chicago? And there was a Teamster strike on. It couldn't get down here. The story I heard from Fred is that one day, Joe Kapowski, as a grad student, comes into his office with a piece of paper. And Fred says, "What is this?" "Oh, this," says Joe, "is my receipt for the rental truck." "What? Do I have this right?" "Well, I decided since we needed it down here, I decided to rent a truck and bring it down. And so it's in the lab. And here's the receipt for the rental truck." Now, do I have this approximately correct, Joe? Thank you.
And then how was it used?
Oh, when I first, it was part of the idea of force feedback, which we now would call haptics and various other things. But the idea was that the computer could in some way show your sense of touch, and there are disagreements what that means exactly. But when I got here as a grad student in '73, Jerry Kilpatrick took us back, and the two arms, one had a hand grip and the other had the tongs. And so you could stand on one side of the graphics lab and in the other little room, the TV camera, and you could see if you could pick up children's blocks and stack them with it, with the idea, not that the computer would learn to stack blocks, that was what Stanford was trying to do, but that the human could, and the computer could generate that sense of touch if it was something like fitting a small drug molecule into a protein. And of course, that was eventually accomplished about 12, 14 years later here, which will be discussed in due course this afternoon.
And I have one
know
other
about my-
thing.
Yeah, I think let's
Oh,
let Jane go.
Yeah, so what I remember about it was playing with it, which was fascinating. And it was one of the things that might drip oil on you or bang into you. But I particularly remember Fred deciding that it wasn't ready yet. And he put it in mothballs for 10 years and brought out the concept 10 years later.
Which was
We had another one of those arms later that was the Sarcos arm, and it was a 10,000 PSI machine that would hover like a snake, had 3 degrees of freedom on the hand and 6 on the arm, and you could do all these things with it. And so one of the students one night it had a dead man switch you had to put on for safety to make sure that you were not putting yourself in danger, and if you didn't have it on, it would just shut down. Well, Fred came in the next day after a student had worked the night before getting it to work, and he said, "Well, I couldn't get it to go, so I had to clamp down the safety switch to make sure that the thing would go." And this $100,000 whatever machine the next day was under the floor stored, and as far as I know, it's still under the floor stored today, because it was so much more important that the students be okay, and so tempting to a student to do that again, that he's just like, "We're not going to do this with his equipment."
Mm.
And I must say that my favorite publicity picture that was on one of those department posters that used to be done every year, because that was the only way we had for people to request information about the department, was Russ with his hand on the argon arm in front of the great big screen wearing a head mount. I'm like, okay, I've got a display here, a display there. That works fine if you've got company, but it's kind of like there's a picture of me with a wire wrap gun, and the wire wrap pins are pointing away from me. Okay.
Mhm.
Our publicity people are much better than that now. And they have done a wonderful job organizing this. Henry has a story.
Could I mention how critical Fred was in the early days, like 1978 in particular, to VR? So when I came in 78, when I met Fred, I immediately felt a kindred spirit, not just in graphics, but in interactive 3D graphics and immersively, in our space. I mean, we call this virtual reality now, but there was no name for it then. It was, we do interactive graphics, we see this in stereo, we move the devices like they would move in the, we call it virtual worlds, but like the toothpick, all of these. It was just fabulous. But I remember coming here and telling Fred, I'm worried. I said, because one of my former fellow grad students, Jim Clark, who had graduated like a year and a half before me, was just getting a research appointment at Stanford. And I knew the people at Stanford. I knew what he was doing. They were working on the stuff that we now call virtual reality. I said, with head mount displays, we could do things with moving arms. We could do the tracker, all this. But frankly, I remember talking to Fred. I think Jim Clark at Stanford could get all this done in 5 years, because it's just the real-time graphics, it's the display, it's the tracker. I think it could all be done in 5 years. And Fred, with only a little bit of a pause, says, I think there might be a thing or two we could contribute to that. And I remember that as such an encouragement that I thought, what could we do? We're just, a little backwoods place. No, said we could probably do a little bit here. And so I remember Gary, within, I don't know, the first year, we had tracking of the head of the graphic system, right? We had stereo. Within a year, we met Mary and Nick in their house, right? I mean, we heard about this graphic system that Nick and Mary were building, and we were so blown away, the two of us, that I remember we walked out because they weren't sure if they're going to do a company or whatever. They were both graduate students. And Fred and I said to each other, even if they don't start a company, can we just pay them to build us one of these systems? This is what led to Iconis. And it was the central thing that made so much of that generation of graphics possible. It was so good that years later, I remember talking with you, Mike, when the new thing came out. Jim Clark, this former, fellow grad student, started this company called Silicon Graphics in like 1984 or something, and had nice 3D graphics. I remember talking to you, Mike, and says, shouldn't we get one of these? And your answer was, the Iconis systems we have are faster, they're more flexible, they have the video digitizer. There was a list of things you told me, which none of the newest systems from Silicon Graphics could do. And you said, so why exactly should we get this new thing from Silicon Graphics? And we didn't for years, because what Nick and Mary designed in the late 70s and built in 80 and so on were like so great. I mean, I just can't say enough. And the crucial step in that was Fred saying, as we left their house in circa 1979, we want to get one of these, even if they don't make a company. That was Fred, an ability to make a decision.
They got system number 3. Thank you, Henry, for those lovely words. It was a great time. Fred was a wonderful character personally. And how about his personal characteristics? We've heard some of them. Anyone want to say anything else about that?
I would like to mention just a gesture. Before then, I have an audio visual aid. I don't know if anyone remembers the View project.
Yes, yes.
And this, this was one of our great t-shirts. So Dr. Brooks did something I had never heard of before. I was his TA in the computer graphics course one year, which was, an honor and a learning experience of its own. And that was more than enough reward for doing it. And at the end of the semester, he asked me into his office and he said, I have something for you. And he reaches under his desk and he pulls out this. It's a huge, heavy book called The Grammar of Ornament. And it is this gorgeous color printed book. I don't know if any of this is going to get through, but it is all about designs and patterns from all over the world for generations.
Wow.
This is me. He got it. This was perfect. This was a book I wanted but could not afford. And we had never spoken about it. And suddenly it was gifted to me and inscribed. That's probably too weak to say, but there's an inscription from him. And speaking about care, it blew me away that not just that he gave me a gift for being a TA, dude, you paid me. But not only did he give me a gift, but what an insightful gift. It was a tremendous expression of character. And I have never forgiven him for it because it's wonderful. It's just wonderful. And, you know, I still own it. It's still on my shelf.
I would close my part with something that Jim Lipscomb reminded me of, that Dr. Brooks, one of his many parables was the one of the circular racetrack with the hurdle. And you'd get running, you'd get going on your project, and bam, the circular racetrack, there's the hurdle. You got to get around it, get over it, do something. You get running again, come around, bam, and it's the same hurdle. And it's harder this time because you've already fixed the easy things. And then you get going and wham, there it is. And in our case, in the mid-70s, it was the 16-bit memory addressing limit. So everything programmed data had to fit in a very rigid amount of space, about 64,000 bytes. And so the first time you'd hit the hurdle, you'd squeeze something down. And the second time you'd hit the hurdle, you'd squeeze something down. If you wanted to add something new, something's going to have to go, or you're going to, and again, all the easy stuff, you'd already converted the 16-bit integers to 8 bits and all that stuff. And you just keep hitting it. And Dr. Brooks's insight was that by having a connection to the IBM mainframe in the basement, you could put an awful lot of that heavy computing down there. And that kept us free from the limitations that most other labs doing this kind of work did. And that wasn't the only hurdle, for example, that he got the other faculty all working together so that we had compilers, we had libraries for memory management, we had libraries for the graphics routines, and it all made our work possible. He wanted to make sure that there wasn't any hurdles in our way. And as Ed Britton put it, the Dr. Brooks bought the field, brought in truckloads of compost, got grants to buy the plows, and let us plant the seeds.
Very nice, Mike. Go.
Could I add to that with
Absolutely.
the mini computer? So when I came here in 78, one of the things that was disappointing to me was that the department had no computer. And I, being a graduate student in Utah in the early 70s, of course, we had tons of computers. I mean, I cannot tell you the difference. In 1970, whatever, when I arrived in Utah, we had 2 big PDP-10s, we had PDP-11s, we had PDP-9s. They were computers, small mini computers that were literally gathering dust. That, you know, if you were a graduate student, you ask somebody, can I use that Nova there? Sure, dust it off first. Okay, I come here in 78. There's 0 computers. Everybody's using the 360. The only computer here, correct me if I'm wrong, was this mini computer that was in the graphics lab that was totally devoted to input-output. Because, you know, there were these 19 really interesting input devices, and there was this really nice state-of-the-art calligraphic graphic system. And so this mini computer was for input-output entirely. So I tell Fred, you know, I'm used to working on a Unix system because, you know, you could power it down, you could power up, you could write new things to it, you know, that's what you do, right? And so he says, right, how about this? He says, how about if I give you half the machine? What? What? Okay, here's what we'll do. How about if we divide the day into 4-hour chunks? We'll use, you know, half the 4-hour chunks for the graphic system. You know, this was grip and other things. And you guys could use the other 4-hour chunks for Unix or whatever it is. How's that for generosity? Now, you could tell the story by bringing this up. Now, could I just mention that there was, I think, 4 graduate students, you, Steve Bellevin, I have this right? Right, Lee Nackman, there was Tom Truscott at Duke. I think there was a 4th person at, wasn't there a 4th person at UNC? But anyway, the complication was that because this MIDI computer was just used for input-output devices, there was no tape drive on it. And the great new thing was a single, if I remember, a single removable hard drive. You know, removable meaning that, you know, you take the cover off, you know, unscrew it, and then you have this platters, and you could take it to another machine. Well, you want to take it to another machine, which has a tape drive, because at that time, Unix came to you as tape from Kernahan and Ritchie or whoever, you know, at Bell Labs. So we had this tape, and we had this mini computer, and we had the removable hard drive, but no tape drive. You want to tell the rest of the story?
Well, there's a too much to tell, but Dr. Brooks was very supportive on all of that. And the large interest in the department was because of the compiler building tools on Unix at the time. And so that was the big incentive to have Yak and Lex and those other tools for doing that. And so he was supportive of that. And even if it meant, as you said, sharing that mini.
Oh, I thought the part that you want to tell was
Oh.
that, okay, so how did you bring up Unix on the tape?
The procedure was go over to Duke, and then they would build the system there and put it on a tape, but tape would go down to the computer in the basement. We actually at the time had no removable disk drives on the mini. It was a single fixed head fast
Oh.
disk just for.
Wow, I remember it differently.
That's okay. But anyway, but no, it was the 2 universities working together that decided to do this and came up with the Unix trucking and transport was the name of the operation. And so the image that was going to run on the PDP-11 mini came up through that same high-speed channel that we used to send graphics information up and human interaction device down.
So my understanding is what you came up with the name was because inevitably something would not be complete in the image, right? And so then Tom Truscott or somebody at Duke had to.
Yeah, we shouldn't get too many old stories, but the next to the last build, the address for the terminal driver for typing stuff had been missing a leading 0, saying it was an octal number. And Jim Lipscomb and I were just determined. So we spent 4 hours playing linkage editor and by hand changed every reference to the terminal driver. And it came right up.
Wait, my reflection was that before this, you had to go to Duke to get a new image onto a tape, which would bring down to Chapel Hill. Did I remember this correct? That's why it was called trucking and transport.
It was harder back then. I'm going to ask in conclusion that these 5 people give you one word that is how they most remember Fred. And we'll do the kind of the thing of starting with the junior people, and the junior person would be Andrew, right? Yes. No, Russ. One word.
I would say fundamental.
All right. Fundamental. Andrew.
Caring.
Caring. Ooh, we didn't caring. We don't have a story about that yet. Henry.
Gentlemen.
Mike.
Unconstrained.
And okay, Russ, you got to give your always.
Wait,
Oh,
David.
never uncertain.
Oh, David
always-
Jane, but I'm going to get, he's got an aphorism.
Never uncertain, always open.
So unconstrained. Jane and/or Dave. One word.
You're muted.
Oh. Thank you, Russ.
Well, unbeatable. I don't know.
Whoa.
would
Woo, that's a,
use
that's
also a lot of the other words, so being last is hard.
indeed, indeed. We are stopping slightly early because the next panel, there is not a break. I invite you to stand up and stretch. The Eve team is going to meet down here and have a photograph made, and we're going to rearrange and we have a wheelchair to get to the stage for the next panel. Thank you very much for your attention.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.